Welcome everyone to tonight's event on the politics of form in Black US literature, which is part of the Wales and the World Outreach Programme, led by the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing and the Cultural Institute at Swansea University. And I just want to thank you so much before we begin, just for joining us this evening. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Dr. Rachel Farebrother, who will be discussing the politics of form in Black US poetry from June Jordan's Dry Victories, a phototext for children, to Claudia Rankine's highly acclaimed Citizen and American Lyric, which is a collection of prose, poetry, and visual images, and they both seem like really interesting texts, so I can't wait myself. And Dr. Rachel Farebrother is a senior lecturer at Swansea University, and a lot of her research is specialising in African American literature and culture and the Harlem Renaissance. And she's written several articles on post-colonial literature, and especially writers of South Asian diaspora. These include Aga Shahid Ali and Anita Desai. And she's also co-editor of A History of the Harlem Renaissance and African American Literature in Translation, so 1920 to 1930. So yeah, a very, very warm welcome to Rachel, and we're really thrilled to have you here this evening. So that's enough for me. I'll let you begin your talk now. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel.
So my talk focuses on Black resistant aesthetics, especially the use of purposeful juxtaposition of word and image to expose racist hypocrisy that's been hiding in plain sight. And focusing on two historical moments, the Black arts movement in the 1960s and early 1970s, and contemporary Black poetry in the US, I'll pay attention to the politics of form, concentrating on June Jordan's Dry Victories, which is a pioneering book for children from 1972, and Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American Lyric, which is an experimental collection that combines prose, poetry, photographs, video stills, and much more. My aim is to interpret Rankine's and Jordan's diverse, resistant aesthetic modes of telling in their own right, but also as signal examples of the use of productive juxtaposition for political critique that's been deployed by Black artists across the diaspora. So such techniques have been employed by collages like Rhan Bairden, who you can see here, his work on the screen, Wangechi Mutu, who is also a collagist, and then poets like Rankine and Jordan, who create aesthetics of assemblage by staging dynamic interplay between word and image. So why have Black US writers so often developed collage forms that establish dynamic interplay between word and image? And what creative and political possibilities emerge when writers create multimedia forms? The Black arts movement of the 60s and 70s is often seen as the cultural wing of the Black Power movement, a much broader push for Black political, social, and economic self-determination. The Black arts movement was conceived as a moment of artistic and political rejuvenation, which involved, among other things, reinterpretation of African and African-American history and identity, and also the creation of Black-owned cultural institutions like theatres and publishing houses. And the aim was that these would foster cultural expression in line with what Larry Neal saw as the main tenet of Black power, the necessity for Black people to define the world in their own terms. And it's also a period that saw extensive experimentation with collage and multimedia forms. So I need to change the slide. There we are. So the most obvious manifestation of this interest in the creative possibilities of collage emerged in the work of Barrdon. So in the 60s, Barrdon experimented with collage, juxtaposing images from various historical periods and cultural sources. He combined materials from African sculpture, Chinese calligraphy, and European art with the jagged edges and improvisational patterns of jazz. And he did this to create tension and even disorientation through his jarring arrangement of multiple cultural reference. Barrdon described himself as a cubist. He was interested in exploiting cubist techniques of fragmentation to explore the relation between time, vision, and space. And he was part of a tradition that stems back to Pablo Picasso and George Braque's experimentation with collage in the years before World War I. Picasso's description of his collages as a deliberate attempt to disorientate the viewer. He wanted to create a sense of strangeness that would make people think about a world that was becoming very strange and not exactly reassuring. This description resonates with Barrdon's use of collage to challenge viewers to face up to unsettling realities. Barrdon also presented his work as being part of the blues and jazz tradition. He emphasized what he called call and recall in his work, and he likened his use of reprised themes and motifs to the patterns of riffed repetition in jazz and blues. And in a really interesting introduction to a catalogue of Barrdon's collage, the African-American novelist and essayist Ralph Ellison noted that Barrdon used Cubist techniques to his own ingenious effect, marrying the vernacular forms of the blues with modernist style to represent what he called the signs and symbols of a humanity that has struggled to survive the decimating and fragmentizing effects of American social processes. So in the hands of Black US artists, collage becomes a means to subvert accounts of American history, which are, in Toni Morrison's words, characterized by obfuscation and distortion and erasure, so that the presence and the heartbeat of Black people has been systematically annihilated in many ways. Barrdon's collages demonstrate, I think, the radical potential of such assemblage. So you can see on the slide an example of Barrdon's collage. Unfortunately, I don't have time to speak about it in that much detail, but you can see that the fragmentation and disorientation generates what Kabina Mercer has called an understanding of African-American identity as something that has itself been collaged by the vicissitudes of modern history. But he also very interestingly uses this technique of collage to emphasize conviviality and community. The sidewalk is full of people strolling, talking, leaning, looking out of windows and sitting on stoops. So it kind of has this really interesting doubleness, and there's something very interesting about how the viewer engages with this. Before our eyes, it once fragments and becomes a whole. So beyond this literal manifestation of collage, the Black arts movement also saw the emergence of fruitful experimentation with multi-generic form in more unexpected places, most notably in children's literature. And I'm going to take the example of June Jordan's Dry Victories, which is a really interesting phototext for children. Here's my sort of show and tell. And it takes the form, in terms of the narrative, of a conversation between two teenage friends, Jerome and Kenny, and they're preparing a talk about two moments in American history: the civil rights era and also Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War that saw attempts to reform the social and political system after the abolition of slavery. So tacking between these two moments of possibility that didn't live up to all that they promised, the boys weigh up the achievements and legacies of what they call two times that still be hanging us up. And what Jordan does is assemble collages of photographs and reproductions of historical documents, and she includes that in the text. So what Jordan does, I think, here is she avoids any easy answers or portable messages. Instead, what she's doing by putting all of these documents together is cultivating a skeptical, politically engaged readership and asking difficult questions about what can be done about what she calls the aftermath of aftermath. And in an author's note at the end of the collection, she reflects on the significance of the multimedia format of Dry Victories. She describes history as the business of choose and show, which I think is just a brilliant way of describing history. The historian's task, it seems, is to provide readers with the means or the ammunition to challenge dominant histories and official records. So Jordan's clear-sighted evaluation of how what we won was not nearly enough. So she's writing here, you know, in that period just after the civil rights movement. Her response to that is to construct an expansive archive, taking the facts up front, making them accessible. But it's also about living complex histories. So this is an approach that lays bare the ideological choices and racialized assumptions that govern white and colonial accounts of the past. History don't stop to let nobody out of it, Jordan explains. So go ahead, get into the facts, and then we can move on. And sadly, I tried to photograph the book to put on the slides, but it just didn't work very well at all. But the book is, as you can see, it's kind of full of photographs and documents alongside the text. And the incorporation of these documents wholesale into Dry Victories establishes dialogues between word and image, history and literature, sociology and law. And it underlines the importance of taking an interdisciplinary approach when testing the limits of dominant historical narratives. So it's all about the juxtapositions between these different documents and between the story that, that Jordan is also telling. She's seeking to foster active critical engagement with the process of narrating history, one that invites interrogation of apparently authoritative sources of knowledge, whether it be history books or photographs or maps or legal documents. And Jordan stages encounters between multiple texts from the archive to uncover misinformation and bias. But she also creates new narratives by way of research and curation, making visible the ideological choices that underpin historical narratives that are often presented as transparent truth. So Jordan's pocket-sized book, which is packed full of photographs and historical documents, and is crucially aimed at children, is all about getting those children to ask questions about history and to be active in how they interpret the past. So, so this is one moment where we see, you know, this really interesting use of kind of collage form. My second text that I'd like to think about is by the contemporary Jamaican American poet Claudia Rankine, and it continues this tradition of formal experimentation and active reader engagement to address contemporary US politics and culture. Citizen and American Lyric not only challenges our expectations about lyric poetry, It's also an experimental collage of different genres and media. So we have prose, poetry, paintings, photographs, and videos. Like Baird and Jordan, Rankine experiments with form to raise questions and to position readers in such a way that they must actively engage with the collection, to explore the extent to which race and racism distorts personal encounters in the US, among all sorts of other things as well. So Citizen, an American Lyric, was published in 2014 in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, and it is, among other things, a cultural response to racial injustice, including the killing of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in 2012 by George Zimmerman, a white neighborhood watch member who was charged only as a result of a public outcry. Zimmerman was acquitted of second-degree murder in a trial that, in Lee Gilmore's words, posthumously put Martin on trial for his own murder. And one dimension of Citizen is its weary testimony to the precariousness of Black lives in the United States, especially in the context of police violence. So in section 6 of the collection, Rankine combines what she calls situation videos, and you can watch these on YouTube, that are sort of a mixture of poetry and video that respond to the cases of Trayvon Martin, Mark Duggan, the Jenna Six, and others. And that is interwoven with a collage of the CNN coverage of Hurricane Katrina, which also exposes a callous disregard for Black lives. The section culminates with an unfinished memorial to Black diasporic subjects who died too soon because of police violence, or violence also committed by white citizens. So in an elegiac tribute, Rankine memorializes those who've lost their lives too soon. And in the first printing of the collection, she memorialized 4 men, Jordan Russell Davis, Eric Garner, John Crawford, and Michael Brown, whose killing was the impetus for protests in Ferguson, Missouri. Rankine left space on the page for the names of future victims to be remembered, and in each subsequent printing of Citizen, new names have been added to the list and mourned, and you can see from the slide how that has kind of played out in different editions. This memorial should be read in dialogue with the cover image for the collection, which features In the Hood, an installation by the conceptual artist David Hammonds. So Hammonds cut or hacked off the hood from the rest of a sweatshirt and hung it in an art gallery. When Citizen was published, many readers assumed that Hammonds had made this piece in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin, because Martin's hoodie became iconic after Zimmerman's defense argued that that he brought on his own death by wearing clothing that kind of marked him out as from the hood. In fact, the artwork was made in 1993 as a response to the beating of Rodney King by the Los Angeles Police Department in 1991. So like the unfinished memorial in part 6, Hammond's installation captures the exhaustion that is a dominant note in Rankine's exploration of a long history of violence. So there's a weary kind of feeling that little has changed, especially because the suspension of the hood against a white background also summons up the spectre of lynching. So it's kind of haunted by the kind of KKK hood, I think. So Citizen is unflinching in its attention to racialized police violence, but much of the collection is concerned with everyday racism. Rankine concentrates on the psychological and physical effects of everyday racism, or microaggressions, a term, as Mariam Thaggart notes, that ineffectively captures the potentially traumatic weight of repetitive racial slights. When she was writing Citizen, Rankine asked friends to share their personal experiences of moments when personal encounters suddenly shifted as racism kind of came into play. Citizen is a creative engagement with their responses, and Rankine has even described it as a community project. The collection documents everyday incidents of racism when going to the therapist, queuing in a line, traveling on a train, viewing a house with an estate agent, driving in a parking lot, and talking with a friend. These personal encounters morph from ordinariness into something painful. And as Cameron Javadavisa explains, readers aren't confronted with truths that are so shocking that they're hidden from view. Instead, they're faced with experiences so common that we have been inured to seeing what shocks and pain they regularly deliver. So Rankine presents what she calls the accumulation of racial slights, bringing the reader face to face with the draining emotional reality of everyday racism. And the kind of juxtaposition of many examples of this is crucial. In the collection, readers are faced with a barrage of examples of social slights and painful communication that build up to a profound sense of alienation. As Rankine explains in an interview, I wanted a feeling of accumulation. I really wanted the moments to add up, because they do add up. I wanted to come up with a strategy that would allow these moments to accumulate in the reader's body in a way they do accumulate in the body. So in addition to paying a careful attention to the kind of traumatic weight of microaggressions, Rankine juxtaposes everyday racism with police violence and racialized state neglect, because of what she sees as a tendency to overlook the connections between everyday racism and the creation and enforcement of racist laws. And it's this kind of active participation in the creation of textual meaning that is implied by juxtaposition rather than being spelled out, that I think summons up and recalls the way in which we read visual collage. So when he was writing about Beddon's collages, Ralph Ellison spoke about how they reveal that which has been concealed by time, customs, and our trained incapacity to perceive the truth. Just like Beddon, Rankine uses an indirect approach. She doesn't make explicit comment. She doesn't tell readers what to think or adopt an attitude of direct protest. Instead, she orchestrates interplay between fragments to make the unseen manifest. And that phrase is Allison's, not mine. So Citizen is a really powerful, capacious collection, and it rewards careful reading. There's so much to say about it. Rankine uses the second person you rather than the first person I, and she does this to underline the encounters that, as she puts it, can't happen to the brown or black body without the white body. But my focus is the dynamic interplay between word and image, and the way in which that draws readers into the collection and really underlines a sense of kind of involvement and complicity. So the collection is full of reproductions of paintings, sculptures, video stills, and photographs. The images, interestingly, aren't accompanied by captions. Instead, they stand on their own terms, and the artists are credited only in the notes. The images aren't illustrations. They don't simply depict what's happening in the poems. Instead, they interact and complicate, opening up new avenues for interpretation, creating new juxtapositions. And in the time I have left, I just want to speak about a number of these images and think about how they force us to read, moving between looking and reading, and how this creates, sort of generates new meanings. So I want to begin with the first photograph in the collection, which is Michael David Murphy's Jim Crow Road. At first glance, it's tempting to imagine that this image has been photoshopped. You know, surely no one would want to live on a road called Jim Crow Road with all its connotations of segregation and racism. But in an interview, Rankine confirms there is, in fact, a Jim Crow Road in Flowery Branch, Georgia. The photograph appears after an account of an experience in middle school where a white girl copies the speaker's work in an exam and then tells her she has features like a white person. As the speaker wryly notes, you assume she thinks she's thanking you for letting her cheat and feels better cheating from an almost white person. The relationship between this story and Murphy's photograph is oblique, but both the text and the photograph fix attention on the continuing influence of racism upon everyday life in the suburbs, schools, and landscapes. As Catherine Gander notes, Murphy's empty, eerie photograph of a nondescript suburban street illustrates how the topography of the American landscape remains inscribed along lines of racism and white supremacy. With its pristine white houses and the Jim Crow sign that bisects the visual field, the photograph recalls the Jim Crow signs that were a prominent feature of the US South in the first half of the 20th century. And as it happens, there are numerous photographs of Jim Crow signs in the Library of Congress archive, because they were often photographed as part of the great documentary photography project of the 20th century, the Farm Security Administration, or FSA, which was ran as part of Roosevelt's New Deal. Murphy's photograph demonstrates the persistence of racial segregation in contemporary America, which, as in the earlier FSA images, becomes part of the fabric of the built environment. And Rankine intended Murphy's photograph of Jim Crow Road to frame the book, as she puts it in an interview, to disturb and unsettle, exposing how everyday choices about where we live perpetuate segregation. Other images in the collection work in different ways. They move beyond words to find means of representing the emotional pain inflicted by racism. And one of the most shocking examples of everyday racism in the ordinary middle-class world depicted in Citizen is an account of a woman who arrives at her first appointment with a therapist who specializes in trauma counseling. The therapist screams at the top of her lungs, "Get away from my house, what are you doing in my yard?" because the woman on her doorstep is Black. Rankine's account of the incident, which I've reproduced in part on the slide, captures the pain inflicted by this experience not least by recording the therapist's angry speech and likening her to a wounded guard dog who's gained the power of speech. The would-be patient who's come to the therapist seeking help but ends up being attacked manages to explain that she has an appointment, but her words are not recorded on the page. She's silenced, stopped in her tracks by unexpected aggression, who completely disregards the pain she's inflicting. This incident appears alongside Kate Clark's Little Girl, a sculpture that grafts the face of a young girl onto the taxidermized body of a young deer-like caribou. It's difficult to look at this image without noticing the vulnerability of the young caribou, an animal that is often hunted. The little girl gazes at the viewer in a manner that is suggestive of the patient's vulnerability and silence as she stands traumatized and mute on the therapist's doorstep. The sculpture's expression is mute but questioning. But Clark's use of assemblage, the way she grafts together human and animal bodies, is also disturbing and uncanny. It recalls troubling associations between humans and animals that were part of the cultural imagination that justified the sale of human beings for profit in chattel slavery. So finally, I just would like to think about how Citizen ends. Citizen resists the idea of any definitive ending. As the speaker notes, I don't know how to end what doesn't have an ending. Given the impossibility of a definitive ending in a text concerned with the endless, exhausting repetition of racial slights and racialized encounters, it's telling that the collection concludes not with words, but with a reproduction of J.M.W. Turner's Slave Ship from 1840. A visual representation of the horrors and dehumanization of chattel slavery. The painting depicts the notorious slave ship, the Zong, from which in 1781, 132 enslaved Africans were thrown overboard to drown at sea. The crew intended to claim on their insurance, an act that underlines how the enslaved were regarded as commodities rather than people. On the opposite page to the painting, Rankine reproduces a close-up of the painting that depicts a shark devouring a shackled limb to underline the horrifying inhumanity of transatlantic slavery. Rankine's decision to conclude the volume with a visual representation of the brutality of chattel slavery is significant for several reasons. First, the direct reference to slavery prompts readers to review the entire collection, noting the extent to which the middle-class suburban worlds that Rankine depicts have been shaped by what Saidiya Hartman has called the afterlife of slavery. Secondly, the juxtaposition of the painting with the close-up brings into focus Rankine's sustained interest in perception and ways of seeing. Rankine establishes a connection between people's failure to see or recognize everyday racism and the potential for readings of Turner's image that gloss over its searing critique of the inhumanity of slavery to concentrate on its romanticism. The close-up forestalls any interpretation of Turner's painting that highlights its beauty rather than mass murder. Throughout Citizen, readers are invited to look beyond the surface, to search deep within themselves and the cultural imaginary, to understand the extent to which looking, perception, and understanding are all implicated in histories of segregation, racism, and enslavement. Taken as a whole, Rankine's powerful collection prompts readers to look and read closely, shifting attention towards an racial imaginary that goes unexamined and unexplored. The dynamic interplay between word and image is integral to Rankine's demand for active engagement with material that brings unsettling realities into view. In the reception of Citizen, much has been made of the inventiveness of Rankine's multimedia form, which I think is quite right, but her deployment of her mixing of genres and of word and image should be read alongside a whole series of Black diasporic texts and artworks, including Jordan's phototext for children and Mercer Collage collages that have also mobilized the productive juxtaposition of word and image for the purposes of political critique. Okay, thank you.